This is part 3 of the Trauma in the Body series for the CETP training, week 4. So I wanted to get this completed and up so you could enjoy it. It's information that most people are kind of familiar with anyway, so I'm going to move through it fairly quickly so that we don't waste a lot of your time. But I want to talk a little bit about the origin of this study. The Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which was a collaboration between the Kaiser Permanente and the HMO in California and the Center for Disease Control, really emerged out of frustration on the part of Kaiser Permanente. That frustration was related to the fact that they had a weight management program that was quite successful in helping people deal with chronic illness related to obesity. But they found that a good number of the people in the program, once they had resolved the health issues, relatively quickly grew the weight back on and reacquired the chronic health issues. And in their frustration to try to figure out what they could do differently, they began to study what was common in all of the different people that had been through their program. And what the preliminary numbers began to indicate is that there were changes that had occurred in people molecularly due to early adverse childhood experiences. And that those changes were not just biological changes, but there were social, emotional, and psychological changes that have occurred because of these adverse childhood experiences. So Vince Felitti and a number of other researchers began to look at what those things were. And what they found was kind of fascinating. In fact, the Center for Disease Control was very interested in this and has repeatedly said that as far as the etiology of chronic illness, that this has some of the strongest statistical data that they've ever come across. And so when you start looking at an organization that tracks disease saying this is amazingly strong indicators of illness, it's probably a good thing to pay attention. So let me kind of go through the elements that they found that were common in people that tended to have difficulty sustaining any permanent change. The first one of these 10 elements was psychological abuse by a parent or caregiver. Probably not too surprising. Physical abuse by a parent or caregiver. Sexual abuse or exploitation. Physical neglect and abandonment. Emotional neglect. Emotional neglect is a little bit broader. It's not just that you're insensitive to other people's emotions, but you don't really know how to connect well, to get your needs met, to protect, direct, show love adequately. They discovered that substances were abused in the homes of these folks with quite a lot of frequency, even though most did not meet the criteria of addiction. What does that mean? Well, that means that, regular use of a substance that you're abusing, even if you're not addicted to it, would be problematic. They even included cigarette smoking as one of those elements. Was there any mental illness in the family, even mild mental illness like postpartum depression? Didn't have to be a chronic, long-term issue, just a mild, relatively persistent, or frequently reemerging mild mental illness was adequate to create problems here. Separation and divorce was problematic. Domestic violence. Domestic violence, this is kind of an important one because we all kind of figure that that's physical contact or a breaking of property. But in their view, if threats and intimidation were used, that was domestic violence. The problem with that in the United States is that 95% of parents use threats and intimidation to manage behavior of children. And this isn't the same thing as those families that have clearly spelled out rules with clear consequences, and when a violation is made, the already prescribed clear consequences enacted. This really kind of grows out of those families that parent by annoyance. You're in trouble today because you've annoyed me, rather than you've broken the rule that is always in place. Parent or caregiver absent or incarcerated was the last of the 10 elements. Now, these are fairly common things, but in combination, any one of them can be highly stressful all by itself. But when you start combining them, what you're really doing is creating an environment that is going to have that threat response system hot, active, and reactive. And you're going to be reducing access to the neocortex or the parasympathetic or cool system. You're also going to be reducing the activation of the ventral vagal or social engagement system. If those things are impaired or reduced, then all you're left with is hot system activations. And that seems to be the case for a lot of these folks. So let me look at the dose, what we call the trauma dose of this. What they found is almost a third of the people that participated in this study, and that is a lot of folks, 17,000 plus people participated in this first study, and they found 32% had a 0 score. 26% had 1. So what we're saying there is that 58% of the population had 1 or less. 16% of the population had 2, 10% had 3, and 16% had 4 or more. That is if you want to think about the breaking point of the dose factor. What they have found is that people with 4 or more ACE elements in their history are much more likely to present with psychological and chronic health issues. So what we're really saying is, even though only 16% of the population exceeded 4 or more, that 16% accounts for 90% of mental health clients and chronic illness. Let me just review that one more time with you. What we're saying is 9 out of 10 people that walk through the door for a chronic illness or for mental health services have had 4 or more of these in their history. So even if you did not plan to work with trauma, you are working with trauma. And it would probably be a good idea to be pretty well informed about it, because these changes that occur early in the developmental life of a person then change perspectives, perceptions, behaviors, belief systems throughout the rest of the lifespan of the person. They also change a person molecularly, change how the cellular functions operate, which also is persistent throughout the lifetime. So we don't spend enough time generally talking to people about the developmental environment, because in most families they just assume that everybody operates kind of like they do, and it's familiar. Just like you don't start every day by getting up in the morning and questioning all of your beliefs and ideas and the things that you hold true. Even people that have had horrible lives and make some outrageous reactive choices to cope with it still don't question it, because it is what's normal for them. Not because it's normal or healthy, but simply for the fact that it's familiar, which is exactly what every one of us do. Now, there are problems emotionally, psychologically, and just about any other domain that you could think of with a higher ACE score. So I'm just going to introduce a couple of these to you. Adults with an ACE score of 4 or higher tend to be 46 times more likely to suffer from depression. So if you grew up in a home that had, say, where you experienced 5 or 6 of these, you're 46% more likely to be depressed as an adult, which means you're adding one of the factors, having a mild mental illness, into your family environment. So these things become exacerbated or increased in power as they're handed down from generation to generation. One of the things we know from all of our study is that early relationships are critical to the development of our abilities to manage and regulate our emotional states, to create, if you will, the emotional state that we desire. The likelihood of an adult suicide attempt increases 30 times when there's an ACE score of 7. Adolescents are much more at risk for suicide with an ACE score of 7. So this is kind of an important point, is these high ACE scores tend to exacerbate whatever situation's going on in the family, and if we don't intervene, then that becomes, over a relatively short period of time, part of the family culture. And the family culture then gets handed down from generation to generation. And if the ACE scores are high in one generation, the likelihood of them being a little higher in the next generation is very good. We also will see a lot of downward mobility, underemployment, having difficulty being employed because of these adaptations that they've made. So this is a slippery slide for folks. And a lot of times in community behavioral health settings today, we're dealing with 3 and 4 generations deep of this. And so expecting to be able to turn it around in 6 or 8 sessions is probably ridiculous, but you certainly can start at least getting a relationship with folks and beginning to help them understand what they're doing and how to help them relax their bodies so they can make better choices. One of the side effects on attachment of having a high ACE score is that we tend to have all the symptoms of attachment resistance or attachment avoidance. People appear guarded and anxious. They're difficult to redirect or to engage. They tend to want support but not allow it or reject it. They tend to use a lot of emotional reactivity. And in fact, they may feel like they're not normal if they're not reacting kind of strongly to something. They tend to hold grudges, grievances. They don't tend to be responsible for themselves. They tend to externalize a lot. In other words, rather than seeing it as it's their choice in the way that they're responding to it, they see it as something that happened to them. They lie for no apparent reason. They tend to engage in a lot of repetitive and compulsive behaviors, and they tend to express strong emotions in relationships that are centered generally around anger, fear, hopelessness, and rages. There are also some tremendous health risks, and I'm not going to go through the whole list for you, but the reality is that chronic illness in the United States is quite often related to family culture and intergenerational transmission of a family culture. Or if you want to think of it as a different way of talking about a family culture, you might think of it as these environmental emotional states that are inherited. And these environmental emotional states, if we don't do something to alter them, they get handed down to the next generation. And that's going to increase all of the problems that we currently have and make them more difficult. And we can see when we go back and looking at 3 and 4 generations ago the changes that have occurred in the chronic health arena. We didn't have anywhere near the amount of chronic health issues, 100 years ago that we have today. Here's an example for just heart disease. And you can look at the multipliers. For example, if you came from a family with 4 of these, domestic violence, mental illness, substance abuse, and physical neglect, those are all 1.4 multipliers. So when you start adding these multipliers together, all of a sudden, you've got some very high risk factors of having heart disease. We also know that there's serious social problems. There is poor quality relationships, poor child to adult relationships. We find that the parents or adults in the household don't relate to each other very well. A lot of unstable friendships, a lot of inconsistent and unstable work relationships, a lot of criminal involvement. And we also find really consistent poor school performance, poor school functioning that are related to higher ACE scores. Essentially what the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente discovered was that as these adversive childhood experiences occur, particularly early in the lifespan, they change people fundamentally at a molecular level, both physiologically and neurologically, and that those changes force people to adapt in ways that are socially, emotionally, and cognitively impairing, and that those impairments allow us to engage in high-risk behaviors, or risky behaviors if you just want to call them that, and that those risky behaviors actually have an effect on the lifespan of the individual. So what we are currently thinking is that people with a score of 6 and above probably will live a decade less than the person that has a score of 0. And there is quite a bit of demographic number crunching going on right now, looking at how this may or may not be true. So that's basically the idea behind the ACE studies. What I'd like to do is just talk one more little piece about this. The symptoms that we see are evidence that adaptations have occurred. We see it over and over and over again. And so having high ACE scores in any environment is going to, of course, force adaptation. And all of those things that get us into trouble, and I'm speaking now from a clinical position, really relate to these maladaptive symptoms that have emerged and now have become part of the environment of the individual and the family that you're working with. You're probably tired of hearing me say this, but it took me a long time to kind of understand how we fundamentally shift at the most basic molecular level, and behavior, perception, beliefs, meaning giving all shift along with that. So understanding the person's history becomes incredibly important to doing trauma work, because there have been changes that have gone on in the body. Trauma is essentially going to have a bodily response. I've had fun kind of doing these for you. I hope that you find this useful, and I will get it posted up to you a little bit later this afternoon. Thank you.